Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome to Resiliency Academy, where we will explore resiliency planning for community and businesses. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Molly Donovan from the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. I'm joined today by my colleague, Casey Porter from Extension, and Liz Gray, State Director from the Small Business Development Center at UNH. We're here to introduce you to resilience. We're doing something new. We're bringing businesses and communities together to consider resiliency planning. This is an exploration of the topic, so we can work toward economic recovery and future planning. This webinar is supported by funding from the CARES Act and is a preview to a full academy we will be offering in 2021. Stay tuned for details. To get started, we'd like to share our Zoom best practices with you. This webinar is being recorded and will be available. Please remain muted and with your video off, except during our introductions. Use the speaker view or gallery view to customize your view. Please use the chat box to share comments, questions, ideas, experiences, anything you like. Casey will be monitoring the chat box and will share your questions and comments with us throughout the webinar. So let's get some information on who is joining us today. We have three very quick polls to tell us and you about those of us joining the webinar. Casey, can you please share our first poll?
Here we go.
All right, it looks like most folks have answered our poll. And very interesting to see, we have a nice mix of those from the business community, community volunteers and municipal staff, and organizations from our state of New Hampshire and possibly even beyond. So thank you for being here. Next, we're interested to know what region of New Hampshire you're from or whether you're from outside of the state. All right, thank you. It also looks like we've got a nice mix from around the state, and 14% of you are from outside of New Hampshire, so welcome. Our presentation today is New Hampshire based, but I think there's a lot from those outside of New Hampshire to learn about as well. And then finally, one last question. Do you have a resiliency plan? Okay, I think these results don't surprise us. It's often common that your business or community would not have one, or you're not sure, or you just don't have one. If you're not sure, I encourage you to check within your community and see, or your organization, whether there is a resiliency plan. But no fear, that's why we're here today to address some of that. So thank you, Casey, for sharing those rules. At Extension, we want to engage with you and have you engage with each other. And we find this a little challenging on Zoom, but we've also found that people like to connect. So we are sending you to breakout rooms for a short 4 minutes with just a few other people to say hello and introduce yourself. You may share what region you're from, your organization, or your interest in resilience. We'll give you these 4 minutes and then you'll be sent right back here and we'll start in with our content. So thanks to everyone. I hope you had a good experience connecting with someone in the room I was in. Two people knew each other and made a connection, having not seen each other for a bit. So we hope you were able to make a new connection or maybe say hello to an old friend. So just a reminder, as we go forward, you can turn off your video so that our presenters are featured on your screen. Thanks. Next, I'd like to share with you a definition of resilience. So where do we start? We see resilience defined for the individual, for business, for the environment, climate, and most recently, community economic resilience. Traditionally, resilience has meant rebounding after a sudden shock, getting back to where we were, or as a lot of people say, getting back to normal. Think about recovering from a flood or a fire or a hurricane. In this time of COVID, we're seeing an expanded definition, and that is more about going forward and springing or jumping forward to a better or a different outcome, to be better than we were before by adapting, innovating, even transforming some of the things we do, and also by connecting and including. We'll talk about these things today. Given this, I'd like to share this framework that really resonates with us, and I'd like to ask you to think about what are called the 4 R's of resilience. So resilience of what? Are you thinking about your business, your community, maybe both? Resilience to what? So what is the shock that you would like to address? Is it just the pandemic, or are there other threats that should be planned for, such as natural disasters, or maybe the slower changes like economic inequality? Resilience for whom? Who are the beneficiaries of this resilience process? Employees, owners, maybe community leaders or community members, new community members? In this evolving description of resiliency, we are called to consider and include everyone when we think about resiliency for whom. And then resilience for what? So what is the goal? What is the bottom line? Are you looking to enhance or keep jobs? Is there a social benefit? Do you want a vibrant Main Street? What does your future look like? It may be that you need a new vision for what your new future will look like. So as we go through the panel today and listen to our experts, I'd like you to think about these 4 questions in resilience and how they relate to the work you're trying to do as a business person or in a community or as an organization. Now I'd like to turn it over to Liz Gray of the Small Business Development Center. She's going to share some background and some thoughts on why we're doing resiliency planning now. Liz?
Thanks so much, Molly, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are so pleased to be here with you this afternoon, but also working with UNH Cooperative Extension to bring New Hampshire its first ever Small Business and Community Resiliency Academy. It's truly a unique partnership and opportunity for us to learn together and to support one another to build those more vibrant communities and strengthen our businesses. And as you can imagine, this is very much an intentional partnership. You know, SBDC has connections to the business community, and Cooperative Extension for years has been supporting communities in a number of different ways. I also want to thank a couple of the other partners that are really helping us at the early stages. For example, Conda Reber, the Executive Director of the Center for Women Enterprise, and her colleague, Jessica Terzakis, both of them are on the call today. And have been really important in the earlier stages of planning. And a special thanks to our folks over at BEA and CDFA for their support to get us where we are. But kind of back to how we're even here today and why we're here. You know, earlier this year, SBDC was fortunate to receive CARES Act funding to not only expand our business advising services, but also to allow us to start the Resiliency Academy planning and run the business resiliency survey that you see some of the results over on the slide. The goal of the survey was to better understand the challenges and needs of small businesses across the state so that we at SBDC and other economic development partners could help businesses recover, reopen, and become more resilient. We were really pleased with the strong response rates. You know, the information that we received in the responses, we knew that businesses were struggling, and that's really what the data quantified for us. but it also highlighted some good news and hope in how businesses were innovating and creating partnerships to help them survive and in many cases thrive during the pandemic. Two questions in particular that I want to highlight that are relevant to today's discussion. One being that we asked businesses how many of them had resiliency plans in place pre-COVID. Sadly, only 19% said that they did. And as a follow-up to that, we asked if they thought having a resiliency plan in the future would be important to their business. And thankfully, 73% of them said yes, it would be important. So, going into the survey, we had a feeling less businesses were prepared for the pandemic, but are really pleased to see that many are now ready to start developing resiliency plans. Every business and likely most communities will face an unexpected disruption at some point. It could be a fire, a flood, a pandemic, but the planning a business or a community does in advance can mean the difference in how quickly they recover. For businesses, according to the Institute for Business and Home Safety, up to 25% of businesses don't reopen following a major disaster. FEMA has that number at nearly 40%. So in my mind, those statistics are rather concerning, and I would imagine you're concerned about them as well. But I think most entrepreneurs these days know that a well-conceived business plan is really important to the success of their business, and we're hoping to help people understand that having a resiliency plan is just as critical to the sustainability and the success of their business in the long run. So a lot of the businesses and communities either on this call today or ones that we expect to be working with in the future will not have started a plan yet. Others may have had some plans in place and just need to update them or tweak them. And some others will have a really robust plan in place. But what we like to say is that we're going to meet you wherever you are, and we'll support you along the way. So no matter where you are, we are here for you, and looking forward to working with all of you. So thank you. And on that, I will turn it back over to Molly.
Thanks, Liz. It's our privilege and pleasure to work with the Small Business Development Center. In Extension, we also have the similar motto that we will meet people and meet communities where they are and begin to work together. So I think that's powerful, and it's okay that we're just starting in on this work of resiliency planning. So thank you. So now I'd like to introduce our panel. I'm so excited today. We've brought together different perspectives on resiliency. We have a New Hampshire business, a rural sociologist, and a community planning expert. We'll hear a little from each of them on resilience, and then we'll move on to some questions and discussions. Again, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and we will take those following our short presentations. First, I'd like to introduce Sarah Rocker. Sarah is a rural sociologist at the Northeast Regional Center for Rural Development at Penn State University. This is the regional research center affiliated with UNH Cooperative Extension. We are so fortunate to benefit from their research, knowledge, expertise, and very wide network. Sarah, please share a little bit about yourself and a short presentation on your work as it relates to community resiliency.
Thank you so much. And I think I've got remote control of the screen now. So I'm just going to double check that that's happening. And I apologize for the delay here. We're just switching over the control of the screen. All right.
Great. Thank
We're
you.
in action. Well, thank you, everyone. And as Molly said, my name is Sarah, and I am so pleased on behalf of the Northeast Regional Center to get to be with you all today. I am trained as a rural sociologist, and I've spent the past 5 years of my research dedicated to understanding the way we think about resilience in the agri-food system. So I recognize that this conversation and Resilience Academy conversation is bigger than just food and agriculture, but I think that you're going to find some of the concepts that I have to share today applicable to this wider topic. And for those of you that are in food and ag businesses, hopefully this will be especially interesting to you. So I'll move to the next slide. So fundamentally, I'm going to talk to you about just really some concepts that we use in research that inform strategy and practice on the ground. And one of the things that I study in particular is networks, social networks in particular, as a big key to building resilience. And one of my favorite definitions, informal definition, but one that I've heard and I just really like to continue to use it, is that a network can be thought of as nets that work. And as I'm sorry about the lag today. Here we go. Sorry about that slide lag. When we think about networks, I'd like you to expand your thinking, not just into a physical network, but actually thinking about a network as all of the invisible lines of connectivity that we have amongst each other. And one of the things that I write about a lot in my research is something called social infrastructure. Essentially, social infrastructure is describing this invisible network. It's the scaffolding of relationships, trust, knowledge, and norms that really enable capacity at multiple levels, at the individual level, as well as businesses and broader economies. And one of the things also that we have fundamentally seen in terms of investing and bolstering development in the food system is really thinking about the difference between hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure development. Hard infrastructure is all of the physical stuff that is needed to enable the capacities of individuals and businesses and economies. In the food world, we think about trucks and warehouses and retail space. But what's really important, and this has really been a big paradigm shift in development in the past probably 6 or so years, is recognizing that social infrastructure is equally as important for undergirding and making it able to really use that great physical infrastructure. So soft infrastructure is, again, those relationships, knowledge, and networks. And again, my research is really grounded in two of the programs that have gone on to fund hard and social infrastructure in the food system, both a USDA program as well as this program called FoodLink, which really sort of look at this idea of, okay, if we have a value chain here of all the different actors in the food system, how do we essentially build that scaffolding, that networking amongst the farmers, the aggregators, and so on? And they came up with this idea that really it needed to be coordinated. And I just want to take a step back here for a second. I recognize that maybe this is the first time that you're hearing the word value chain, and that's very common in my world. So I've made this little infographic using wheat, the journey of wheat to bread. And I just want to say that you can think of a value chain really as the interrelationship along all of the processes here that really make and transform a product and add value at each step along the way. Notice that what's really important here is that these businesses, the farmer, the miller, the baker, and distributor, they need to work together to increase that value. Or they could do all the processes under one roof, but oftentimes that is very cost prohibitive. So when it takes place with individual businesses, there's really this strategic alliance here that we talk about to help move these special products and increase value, not just for one business, but for all the businesses. And in this kind of model, we talk about how it's important to have transparency and good communication, and how they're sharing information, sharing risk, and sharing profits in this model. And why do we talk about this? Well, in a nutshell, in the sort of ag and food development realm, we talk about this because this is the strategy to help the small niche producers have a chance at being competitive against the commodity market. That's one main thing. The other thing that I like to think about is that this model is not about arm's length or competing. It's the idea that the rising tide lifts all ships. So going back to how do we actually invest in this? The USDA thought, well, the way we do it is that we have connectors, connecting all of the different kinds of actors along that value chain, making sure they're aware of each other, and making sure that the information is flowing as it should be, the technical assistance is going to the right direction. My research talks all about in depth of all those roles of what needs to be communicated. So it's about making market matches, it's about giving technical assistance. Sometimes it's about bringing all of those people in the value chain together to have a conversation about where do we want to grow our local economy. And we can talk more if you have questions about the specific roles of value chain coordination, but for now I'm going to just pivot and say a few more words about networks before I end my time here. So when we think about like actually how do you stitch that connectivity of the value chain, I like to think of it in two main ways. And I'm really excited that we have a chocolate producer on today because I think that we can use chocolate as a really good example of this. You know, we start with the transactional actors. This is the cacao producer, then the chocolate being turned into a bar, then it gets distributed or sometimes sold directly in a retail. So those are all kinds of actors that need to be coordinated in a particular value chain. But also it's very important to remember that there are really important people who are not in the value chain, but care deeply about the success of local value chains. Those include extension, local government, funders, and other kinds of advocacy and nonprofits. And the work of value chain coordination, building that scaffolding, it has to go left to right as well as up to down, really making that connectivity along the chain as well as to the support actors. And so in my research, I actually modeled this when we were doing some work with the small grains economy in the more southern part of the US. And this is a really kind of a crazy thing to show you, but I just want to say that in research, we do care about this. We care about trying to model and showing these connections as they take place. And this is a conference that was held, and before the conference, there were the ties of who did business together and who did advice, and after the conference, there were more. And again, there's that picture of that social scaffolding. This is how we actually get that data and show that the social scaffolding is being built. So I'm not here to tell you today about how to model this. Really, my main point is to get you to think about why social scaffolding matters. And in the literature, as well as in some of the work that I've seen firsthand, I can tell you that social infrastructure has these several kinds of impacts. It facilitates trust among those who are connected and in the network. This network provides access to detailed and timely and reliable information, and it really enables a kind of collective problem solving that would not be present if this infrastructure of this network did not exist. And the outcomes that come out of it, both for individuals, business, and the larger economy, is that it's a great way to attract talent and retain talent to the business, to attract and retain partners, to increase productivity, to reduce transaction costs, reducing risk, and promoting innovation. I have examples for all of those things if anyone wants to chat about that later. But my main point, I hope that you know, is that networks are really important. The geeky, it gets even geekier. If you want to go down this route, there's ways that you can think about strategically building networks. But my main takeaway that I'd like you to think of is that having a network is better than having no network at all. So if you want to think about really the different kinds of strategies, we could get into that. But I would say that just starting with thinking that no business is an island and no business will ever succeed as an island. And to just start by fostering connections anywhere is better than having nothing. It's better than just having scattered fragments. And with that, I'm sorry for the lag here on my slides, but with that, this is my final slide. I'd like to just say that there are a couple of resources that if you'd like to learn more about the strategy of weaving networks, here are 2 books that I offer for you. There's also an online discussion group of people who are doing this kind of connecting work for food and agriculture. And I also can share some resources around grant opportunities if you're looking to fund the work of network coordination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that, and encourage people to put questions in the chat. We certainly can come back to you after other presenters. Next, I'd like to introduce Steve Whitman, the founder of Resilience Planning and Design and a part-time faculty member at Plymouth State University. Steve is known throughout New Hampshire and beyond for his work, his very good work in communities. So Steve, I'm going to let you take it away and tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and your resiliency work from an environmental perspective, and even how that impacts or is connected to the economy.
Thank you, Molly. I think you'll see through our short presentations that we're covering a pretty wide array of views of resilience. And last time we did this, it really added to the discussion. So I do encourage you to use the chat and put your questions out there for us. As the founder and principal of Resilience Planning, I think you can probably tell I feel pretty strongly about the word. That I was willing to tie myself to it years ago. And the work that we do, just so you can see the difference between the work that Sarah and Richard are doing, is really a lot of municipal scale work. We do work at the site level, doing evaluation and design for individual projects, but a lot of townwide, citywide planning and facilitation work with communities throughout the Northeast. We also do regional, we are involved in regional initiatives, largely around conservation, but other issues as well. So I just want to go through a couple of slides and paint a different way of viewing resilience that I'm hoping will resonate with some of you and maybe challenge your view of resilience a little bit as well. So let's see. All right. So my first, whoa, I went too far, Casey. If you can bring me back one. I had the same lag issue, I think. Thank you. So for the first slide, first of three slides, I really wanted to talk about the fact that although resilience is grounded in an understanding of the complexity and adaptability of natural systems, I think it has the ability to teach us how to better understand and plan for our built environments as well. So when I say our built environments, as the images may help you understand, I'm thinking our buildings or other kinds of gray infrastructure, roads, water, sewer, things like that, in the many uses they support, including the businesses that we'll be hearing from today and the perspective that Richard will share. All too often, that is a voice that doesn't necessarily come through strong enough in some of the municipal work that's happening. So the second aspect of resilience that I want to touch on is a reminder to incorporate natural systems. So if we can go to the next slide. Apparently it's not working for me right now. In thinking about natural systems, I would encourage you to think beyond the limits of your property, the borders of your town, maybe even the limits of your business for many of you, and to think about opportunities that exist to take more of a systems perspective, that natural ecosystems are really complex and incorporate a systems view as well. And this will, I think, enable you to plan both for the known and the unknown issues and events that lie ahead. 2020 has taught us a lot about the unknown. And in my small group of introductions earlier in this event, we had a little conversation about our lack of ability to predict those events. Natural systems can't predict them any better, but they're equipped. And each component fills multiple purposes, is interrelated to others. So it has a resilience that's built in that we can learn from. And for my last slide, I want to bring it back to something that Sarah really nicely set up for us for our conversations today. And it's the idea of the social. She referred to the social networks. She referred to the safety net. I think all too often resilience actually calls on human relationships and community as the safety net, as the network that's needed locally. And I think ultimately this is really the key to resilience. Moving buildings out of floodplains, thinking about food systems, thinking about renewable energy systems are all wonderful things we should be doing. But at the end of the day, when a pandemic strikes or something challenges your business, it is the network that you have. It's the relationship you have with individuals that will actually allow you to both bounce back, but as Molly said, not just end up where you were, maybe actually end up forward, closer to your vision as a community or as an organization. So it presents a lot of encouragement if we can invest in our networks and in our individual relationships with one another, that overall will be much more resilient. With that, I would like to hand it over to Richard and let him share before we get into discussion.
Thanks, Steve. Certainly, it's very important in New Hampshire to be focused on our natural resources and natural assets. So appreciate your view of resiliency. Now we have our business perspective. I'd like to welcome Richard Tango-Lowy, owner and master chocolatier of the Dancing Lion Chocolate in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm going to let Rich tell you about himself, his business, and the work he does around resiliency. Rich?
Thank you, Molly. And if you would give me the first slide, I'd appreciate it. Perfect. Okay, my name is Rich Tango-Lowy. I've been doing chocolate for about 20 years. Dancing Lion Chocolate's been around here in Manchester since 2007. If you're familiar with us at all, you know, we are very tiny. If you're not familiar with it, whether you're familiar or not, resilience is baked into us from the very beginning, and I'll talk about that. Now, like I said, if you're familiar with us, you know that we tend to downplay our accomplishments a little bit here, but I felt it was useful to put up a few things that we generally don't go out of our way to announce. We're considered one of the top chocolatiers in the world. We don't sell anywhere for the most part, except at our shop in Manchester. So Dessert Professional, top chocolatiers in North America, Lonely Planet in May, going into the pandemic, published the book of the top chocolate experiences in the world. The Restaurant and Bar Awards was kind of neat. That came out of the UK. That's all well and good, but that isn't something we strive for. It's a result of our approach to how we do our business. When I say resiliency is built in, this is going to be very focused on the organizational aspect. When I founded Dancing Lion Chocolate, I founded on the precepts of the Malcolm Baldrige criteria for performance excellence, which has been around since the 70s. It's probably one of the most thorough, holistic, and non-trivial to actually execute approaches to business excellence. I actually have been an examiner for Baldrige in 3 states, and I'm currently the chairman of the Excellence North Alliance, which is the New England sort of chapter, if you will. What we do is we essentially help organizations become more robust. So doing this to a very tiny chocolatier seemed like, to me, it seemed natural, but it's a little bit unusual for how very small businesses work. But I want to talk a little bit about, on a very limited scale, how it applies to what resilience is. If you would give me the next slide, I would appreciate it. Perfect. Thank you. Dancing Lion Chocolate starts with our mission. Our mission is to surprise and delight every customer with perfect customer service and the absolute highest quality products. All of my staff can say this in their sleep. We live for it. It drives what we do, and everything we do drives to it. Our objective is to make a living and have a good time doing it. Notice I did not say our objective is to grow by a certain amount, get bought, or anything else. It is simply to enjoy what the heck we do and be able to do it for a living. Those two things are critical, because where resilience in our organization comes from is no matter what we do, we focus on our mission and objective. So for instance, when COVID hit, we didn't do much very differently. The core structure of the business was already in place to be able to respond. To me, that is the definition of a resilient organization. The question comes about sometimes is resilience a process or an outcome? Resilience is a state of being. It's something that if you plan right and you do the right things, you become resilient. It's part of just how you are. And when things happen, you can respond to them. So resilient organizations produce positive outcomes, sort of despite whatever challenges come up. You may have to adapt how you're doing things and what you're doing, but the core processes for how you adapt don't really change. All right, to make that work, we have to do some things. And from our perspective at Dancing Lion Chocolate, COVID has had an impact on us, but not as big as you would think, and for a lot of reasons. So the first, things started about February. We started hearing rumors. We started planning. I have a general rule for how we plan here as a staff and our board of advisors, which we also have. We hope for the best and plan for the worst. So we like things to work out well. We anticipate they will work out well. And then we plan ahead a year, several years for what if they're really, really bad? And we do this all the time. So when something really bad like COVID comes in, some of that planning, maybe not for that specific event, but for how we would approach an event that may affect our supply chains, our customers. In the past, we've talked about analyzing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, what would be called a classic SWOT analysis. We've talked about things like economic downturn. If the economy crashes, how does it impact us? If our supply chain crashes, how does it impact us? And we talk through this stuff annually. So when something like the COVID event hits, we're actually in a pretty good position to have at least thought through what happens if some of these things occur. The way we then respond, hoping for the best, planning for the worst, is that we've built learning and improving into our entire experience. It's how we do everything. So when we start looking at a risk to our customers being able to come in the shop, we look, okay, so what might we be able to do? What are we learning as it goes? How do we adapt to it? In the example of COVID coming in March, you typically in March, our online revenue stream starts decreasing. It starts getting warmer around the country and the world where we ship. We threw out free shipping, which we don't usually do. We made some special COVID survival packages to make it efficient for us, easy to package with a small staff, put together with a small staff, and it went through the roof. So we basically kept our full staff, actually had to add staff, and punched up our revenue stream by responding. That comes to my fourth point, which is we rely on multiple revenue streams. So people often ask, because we are one small shop in Manchester, if most of our business is online. That is not the case. Probably 75 to 80% of our business is people coming into our brick and mortar shop from all over the world. So less travel, less tourism, obviously an impact. So increasing online to balance, and we did ship through the summer, even though chocolate melts, we had to adapt to that. But there was one other thing we did, which is we typically teach our fourth revenue stream. We teach a lot of classes here in the shop for anybody that wants to come in and take classes. But we're also involved in teaching professional chocolatiers internationally. So one of the things we did to adapt to that is we expanded our collaboration with one of the most well-known chocolate schools in the world, which is École Chocolat out of Vancouver. They taught classes by people going to France, Italy, and other places to get master chocolatier certifications. We developed a master chocolatier certification series of courses that we're teaching over Zoom, 2-week courses from our shop. That increased what was usually a fairly reasonable but small revenue stream into something that's major and gets us through and provides a service. It also helps with our social infrastructure and networking, as Sarah was talking about. So that's kind of the overview of how we approach things. Resilience is just part of, if you're doing it right, it's part of what you do every day, COVID or not. It's what makes you able to deal with this. There are things you can do to become more resilient. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk about all these things in question and answers, but that's an introduction to Dancing Lion Chocolate and how we do things here. So a small business approach. Thank you, Molly.
Thanks, Rich. Certainly a great story of adapting and applying everything you've done in terms of resilience. I want to bring our whole panel back and thank you all for your presentations and invite folks to put questions in the chat if you'd like. I'm going to kick it off with a question or two of my own, and then we'll go to the chat. So thinking about your work in community and business, curious where you think businesses or communities, you can talk from your perspective, are right now. Are they still reacting, adapting? What other innovations are you seeing? Are communities and businesses assessing and planning? And has anyone moved to that recovery stage yet, or that feeling more resilient stage yet? So I'm gonna call on Rich first and give us the business perspective, and then I think we'll go to Sarah and Steve. Rich?
Okay, Molly. Yes, that's actually a really good question. And I think it is across the board. Different segments of industry, for instance, are handling things differently. So for instance, small brick and mortar shops were able to recover somewhat earlier by implementing, for instance, the state recommendations for managing COVID, minimizing the number of people coming in, requiring masks, all those sorts of things, which we've done as well, hand sanitizing coming in. They're in a position to be able to adapt faster. And I would say assess and move forward. Businesses like hospitality have it harder. I think a lot of hospitality is still in the shock and trying to figure out how they're going to do business phase. I know several restaurants, for instance, that early on saw this coming in February, started adapting their businesses then, opened all the way through, and did well of it. I know other businesses, honestly, that have spent their time hoping they'll be open before it gets cold. And to me, that doesn't really follow the hope for the best and plan for the worst rule. That's not adapting and that's not evolving. That is reacting. And I think there's still a lot of reacting out there.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Sarah?
Well, actually, I'm going to share just a project actually that I'm working on with the United States Department of Agriculture. We started a COVID response project for local and regional food system sectors. So this is 16 sectors across the entire food system who are more kind of serving the small and mid-scale producers and small and mid-scale markets. So we've got wholesale, farmers markets, restaurants, institutions, CSAs represented here. And this project has been about assessing through focus groups and surveys, and that each month the kinds of adaptations and innovations they've had to the initial impacts of COVID. So I'm actually just going to drop in a link to kind of check that out. Two things to kind of point you towards are that the impact assessments are by sector, all the challenges that took place, and the innovation briefs are how they've pivoted. It's a little too much to kind of share now, but I think it's a great time where I can just share that link and let you all take a peek at your own leisure.
All right, so my turn. Scratching out notes as you were both talking, because I think that from my perspective as a small business owner, but in a different type of business than Richard, I think businesses have a tendency to be much more nimble and be able to pivot a lot faster than municipalities. Traditionally been pretty slow, but it was interesting to see the rate at which some municipalities, small towns and large cities, really did start to evolve, innovate, and adapt because of COVID. And I think as far as where they are now, I mean, some are clearly still trying to assess what to do next, but we're starting to see engagement in future planning. And I think an awareness of this idea of resilience, way beyond just the natural disasters that we often plan for, and for a broader set of things that impact not only municipal operations, but the businesses that are housed in our communities. So in the past, I think we had to kind of drag people to these conversations and encourage them to put it into their plans and think about it for the future. And I think it's going to be a little bit easier in the near term.
So there seems to be some intersection that you're all referring to with businesses and communities adapting, such as, moving restaurant seats out onto the sidewalk and quickly amending or setting aside local regulations and identifying broadband as an immediate need and whatnot. So how can communities serve the needs of businesses better, and how can businesses be better connected to the communities? Is this a time of opportunity and sort of discovery, especially as you all talk about the value of networks?
I guess that question, Molly, makes me think of an example from that project. And I'm sorry I couldn't answer your last question specifically. It's just that we've heard so many examples, it was kind of hard to pick one. But when you frame it that way, it kind of makes me think about how a lot of the community supported agriculture or food aggregation and food distribution hubs that we talked to spoke about, okay, they in the drop of a hat lost their institutional clients. Like within 1 week, they had no more hospitals or no more colleges or K through 12. The hospitals still wanted some food, but not quite in the same way. But especially the schools, that market dropped out like overnight. But then through certain connections, and again, it's a little bit different for each community, they found out that their emergency food banks were really in a place of need. And so they were able, through that connectivity, to pivot and say, we can repackage these boxes to go out for families as opposed to wholesale orders. But I think that really what's different and unique about every community is who's that person making that connection? Who has that creativity and that vision to think about how to pivot in the supply chain, and who reaches out first? So maybe like a little takeaway for everyone is to think about, in your own perspective, could you be the one that reaches out? Could you be the one that makes that first initial step? Or do you have someone in your community who sees the 30,000 foot view, like a local foods coordinator or a local business coordinator, that can help make those connections?
Actually, can I jump in that? I think that's actually a really good way of thinking about it, Sarah. From our perspective, Dancing Lion Chocolate, my perspective is community is maybe a little bit broader. So we have our local community, Manchester, New Hampshire, which is a lot about communication. It's really understanding what the city can do, what the state's doing, reaching out to deal with some of the people in the city and the state to help them respond, or help them understand what small business needs might be when they respond. Then our community gets broader. Our community is the fine chocolate industry. So we're working a lot with chocolatiers, coaching, and trying to help them get through it. And then it's the entire supply chain. You mentioned the value chain. So for us, our value chain goes back to cacao farmers. We're touching base. What's going on in Puerto Rico? We source from there. How are our folk doing there? What's going on in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize? We keep up with the situations, the people on the ground there. What can we do to help? Some of it's just buying more stuff. Well, so we buy more stuff to help them out. Just business as usual, but kind of adapted some. Because we couldn't get, our packaging is made in Nepal. We couldn't get it out of Nepal. No airplanes. So we actually had it, worked with our packaging company out of Keene, New Hampshire. We had it FedExed, and it cost more, but we needed the packaging and they needed the 20K, because for that 30 people in Kathmandu, it was a big deal. They had COVID coming in. So all of our communities are important, and we can expand and adapt, but I agree, we need to be reaching out to those communities to say, here's what we know, here's what we have, and here's how we can help, and feel free to ask.
Thanks. Steve, do you want to add anything?
I don't think so. I think it's been covered for this question.
Okay, great. So tell me, what is the most challenging aspect of resiliency planning and resiliency work? Why is it hard? Why haven't we already done it?
Okay, so I think one of the issues is we're dealing with humans, and humans don't necessarily plan beyond the hour they're in. And I think it brings up a lot of issues that are complex and can be overwhelming. So in a lot of cases at the municipal scale, we have a limited number of people who are really engaged and thinking about the future. So that's already a challenge. Often those people are the same people that are participating and volunteering in many of your organizations, and may also be business leaders in the community as well. So I just think it's kind of set up to be quite a challenging exercise. And if it doesn't feel really pressing for people, we have a hard time getting their attention. Doubled with the fact that in New Hampshire, we don't really support communities financially to plan for the future. I have to imagine we don't do much better for businesses either. And so they have limited resources and they're trying to decide how to go forward. I think the pandemic has been helpful in the sense that it's shown us the interconnections, and that our business community is totally tied to what happens at the municipal scale. All of our incomes and the services we rely on and our food supply are all tied together. And it became really clear, especially in the spring and summer. So I think the timing is perfect for what UNH Cooperative Extension and all the other partners are trying to do here in New Hampshire in the coming year.
Thanks.
I'll jump in. I'm also getting a little note that says my network bandwidth is low. So someone flag me if I start to sound like a robot. Steve, I really love your point about the human condition. I can't tell if it's the human condition or if it's just our culture and policy that's really been set up to not think about resilience. I think we've traditionally, at least in the United States, we think from a cultural, from a funding, from a policy perspective, we are more reactionary. So that is cultural battle that I think we are fighting. The other piece, you know, I talked about the social infrastructure, and you saw an example of kind of the modeling of how you actually can make visible those social connections. That's very complex. And I think one of the challenges of resiliency building is that it's invisible unless you know to look for it and have a way to show it. And what's tricky also about that is that the folks who are maybe funding it, if you can't see it, it's difficult to invest in it, or it's difficult to sort of comprehend what exactly you're building. You don't really know the value of it either until you need it. So because a lot of this is sort of difficult to see, and it's also got medium or long-term effects that maybe won't be realized in the future, we actually need a lot of, I think, forethought from our policymakers and funders in the room to be thinking about how do you make your RFAs and, you know, investment strategy consider this. There's some thoughts from me.
Great, thanks. I think you've put a challenge out to our funders and policymakers here in New Hampshire. Rich, can you give us the business perspective on the challenges of doing resiliency work?
Oddly, it's not much different than what Steve said. And we see, I've been involved with the Malcolm Baldrige projects for a long time, and we see all the time that people are too busy. It's like every day, the everyday stuff is too demanding and too busy to take the time to plan ahead to make things more robust. Something just went away. Am I still here?
You're still here. Go ahead.
To make things more robust. So the biggest thing that we can always suggest is, yeah, take the time. Resiliency is something you do ahead. You may be busy, you may not be busy, but it doesn't matter, because when something happens, it's too late then. You have to be doing this now.
Okay.
But not now necessarily for COVID. You need to be doing this now for the next thing. It'll help you with COVID, but you really need to be doing it now just for the long term.
Good point. Thanks. I'm mindful of our time today, and I want to pivot over to Casey and see if we've got questions in the chat that we might have for our panel.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, there's some good discussion going on in the chat. We had a question from Liz, and her question is, how do we manifest the non-quantifiable value of natural systems as a preventative strategy so that natural disasters are not just about measuring economic impact? It's a good question.
I would love to jump in because I think I can tee it up for Richard and Sarah. Because I saw this question a while ago and I keep thinking about things to add here. So I think in thinking about it from an ecosystem or natural system perspective, initially, like Liz asked, I think we need to understand what we have and what the benefits are of those systems. And so often at the municipal scale, we would do that through a natural resource inventory, a master plan, those kinds of exercises where we would inventory and understand. But I think we have to go deeper than we have traditionally and really try to identify the full range of ecosystem services that each of those natural resources provide, or that they collectively provide to the community, but also the other different forms of capital that we often don't value with these natural systems. So how they're providing us with the clean, healthy air that we're breathing here in most of New Hampshire, access to clean water. That water is then available for our residents, but also for businesses. You know, you can see where I'm going with that. I think when we do that, we can then communicate to folks in the community why we have these resources, what they're doing for us, and how important it is that we're good stewards of them going forward, and how they may also be part of making us more resilient as a community. If we're going to do that, which I think every community should for their natural resources, I think we need to go beyond and do that for our built infrastructure, do that for our social networks, understand their complexity, understand the benefits provided by them. And then, you know, to kind of tee it up and thinking about businesses as well, where do the businesses fit in? Businesses aren't just for the benefit, the profits to the business owner. We saw the complexity of businesses and the webs of connections in our communities when they had to close temporarily. The jobs and the taxes and all the other things that I'm sure others could speak to more. So I just want to, I guess my point is, inventorying what we have, understanding it so we can communicate it in simple terms so people understand, wow, these just aren't rivers and mountains and local businesses. These are tremendous resources that are setting us up for the future, and how can we foster those relationships and make sure they're going to be here and be part of our vision going forward.
I love so much what Steve just said. And I think I would have said, if I went first, I think I would have said a lot of the same things, Steve. So I'll just kind of mirror in particular and kind of lift up your point about multi-capitals. And I'll actually just drop in a link, since I think I'm wearing kind of the research hat here. If folks want to explore a little bit more, this is one particular framework that we use in sociology. There's some other ones too that I'll share in just a moment. But it is really important recognizing that natural capital is something, as is cultural capital, political capital, human health as a piece of that political capital. And again, back to it is really important. And I wish I could be a fly on the wall, Steve, in your natural resource inventory process for the community. I think my question, is when you've done that, who are the stakeholders involved? And, to me, there's something about if you have individuals, businesses, community members all internalizing that and doing that both at their scale for themselves and their business, and then also doing it at this broader scale that brings them all together, a particular region, maybe that might be a really powerful process. So I'd be really curious to see how that works. And I also really want to lift up what you said about ecosystem services. I think that is kind of a more emergent framework about what are the trade-offs between all of the different kinds of capitals. And the more we can understand and kind of implement that, the more nuanced it'll be. And my last comment with this is back to funders and policymakers. The more that you all understand this work, and planners, you are guiding so much of development. And so to the extent that you can have a nuanced perspective on these multiple kinds of capitals will really change things dramatically.
Okay, I'm going to add on to that, if I may.
Oh.
So different kinds of capital are really important. And that also does tie in, as we've been discussing, into social networks and generally networks. I mean, a lot of businesses get caught up in the fact that it's about basically revenue. And the reality is revenue is, in a way, it's sort of a byproduct of everything else we do. It's nice because it allows us to keep doing what we're doing. But the network of our supply chains, our value chains, the fact that we're tied into everything. So global warming impacts cacao. Cacao is chocolate. It impacts prices, what sort of chocolates we can get. So we have to be involved in that community. Heirloom Cacao, I'm advisor of the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund. So we're looking at what can we do to help make that part of the supply chain robust. It's part of our network, and it's value to us. We make connections with suppliers of rare things that give us more value to our business and make us more robust. Robustness to me is as important as revenue. And robustness is not a word for resilience, I guess. The connections in the education realm for us make us more robust. Those connections give us more, we never advertise, those connections give us more awareness in the world. And that's as valuable as revenue to me. So we look at all the different the kinds of capital that we have that we've built up over the years very slowly and carefully. Those are things that make us robust. They allow us to adapt and adjust. And I will, in the interest of throwing things up on the chat, I'm putting links for the Baldrige program, which is free and worth looking at, as well as Excellence North in New England, because you can contact them for free as well. And there's useful information there.
Great, thanks, Rich. Casey, do we have other questions from our participants?
No, not questions, but more just I'm enjoying watching the conversation and discussion going on in the chat about this need for resiliency planning, and some really nice comments about how people just are not, or entrepreneurs and communities are really not thinking about what's coming next and being prepared for the worst, and maybe not thinking that it would happen to them or their community. So just a great need for this work.
Great, thanks. I wonder if our panel could speak to, I'm getting the sense, this is the right time because folks are dealing with the pandemic. How long do we have to capture people and do this work? And what kind of outreach do we need in our community, or who are those connectors and how do we find them and get that started?
Well, I'll jump in first on this one. How long do we have while people are worried? Once they're comfortable and in the normal realm of things again, we don't have them anymore. So yeah, the time is now. We probably have maybe 8 months, a year, depends on how things go. We don't know, but it's a little sad that we can't draw people into these things more easily in every day, but they're too busy right now. These things are high in the minds and they matter, and we can catch them.
I'm not sure that we're I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm not sure that we're out of the weeds in terms of the pandemic. So yeah, I would agree though with Rich's point that as soon as folks are comfortable, it is more difficult. And when I say folks, I mean, when I'm often thinking about this, a lot of this has to do in the research that I do, a lot of it's right now around consumer outreach and consumer education, letting them know everything that it takes to not have disruptions in the local grocery store or to not have disruptions in the local restaurant or the farm stand. So that's one area that I think there's been a lot of movement and momentum right now and engaging. And I will say that the folks, to your kind of second question or a second piece of that question, Molly, about who are the connectors and how do they get engaged? Again, I think one of my hopes from a takeaway from my earlier presentation is that you all would see the potential for yourselves to be connectors. That really it's a resilient structure doesn't rely on just one master connector connecting everyone and that's it, because if that happens and that one master connector goes away, you have a fragmented network again. So actually in network resilience theory, if everyone is doing their part connecting and then connecting with each other, that is the most resilient structure. So I hope everyone can see the network weaver in each of yourselves.
Thanks.
I guess what I would add, what I was going to add changed about 3 times as I listened to the other 2 speakers. But I think so often we talk about policy, and Sarah talked about it a little bit earlier, and that kind of that top-down component of municipalities, towns and cities deciding, what will guide future change and how to prepare and where infrastructure should go. And communication with municipalities goes in both directions. And municipalities are probably the slowest group to change and evolve. And in New Hampshire, they're relying heavily on volunteers that often change every year, especially in towns, they change every spring. So because a lot of business leaders have been quickly getting up to speed and been very creative in thinking about adapting to the future, and Richard's example was just one, those organizations, as well as our conservation organizations who have seen a huge interest in the natural landscape and huge issues with people trying to get access to nature. So nonprofits, our businesses, our food system, a lot of the leaders within the food system here in the Northeast are seeing a way forward. And I think it'd be really helpful for communities to be hearing from these different groups as part of the communities network, but pushing them to really plan for the future. The evolution at the community level in a lot of cases, but not all, has been on, slowing the bleeding and making the changes they can to get businesses to be able to adapt, but not really thinking beyond 2020.
Thanks. Rich, do you want to add?
Not much I can put on top of that other than if we can all take away one thing, it's to be planning ahead, learning how to adapt. I mean, our take is it'll be nice if all this goes away in a few months. We're planning for having COVID with us through the end of next year. Hoping it won't happen, but planning for it to be like that. If we can get communities to be thinking like that, municipalities, more people to be at least thinking along those lines, it means fewer surprises. We're planning better. And if none of it comes to pass, that's wonderful, but at least we're planning better.
Okay, great. I love that. So one final question I have for the panel. I'm struck by your enthusiasm with your stories and the work that you're doing. So does resilience require optimism?
Okay, well, I'll jump into that one. No. It's like,
Okay,
I see resilience as is realism coupled with strategy and planning. That's it. I mean, optimism can actually get in the way of being resilient. It's a nice thing to have, and it's important. It's that, hoping for the best part, but planning for the worst is realism.
okay. Appreciate that. Thank you. Sarah?
Wonder to what extent Richard's strategy is, by the fact that you're surrounded by chocolates. Maybe you don't need optimism, you just have like happiness bars all around you. No, I appreciate your comment, Richard, on the being pragmatic and, hoping for the best, but really planning for the worst. I think there's a lot there. I will offer a slight spin on that I think it doesn't hurt to be optimistic. And that oftentimes when we think about that resilience, these definitions, as we know, are shifting culturally. It's not about building what was. Sometimes it's about the pivot. And sometimes it's about building better and building beyond the current thing that we can see. And I think to have an optimistic view, to vision what could be better, it's sort of like if you can see it, then you can work towards it. So I think that to that extent, the optimism is really helpful in that future visioning. And chocolate doesn't hurt either way.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sarah, Steve, a final comment about that?
Yeah, I think if we are building towards something new at whatever scale, at the community or business scale, if we're building towards a vision that we have for the future, that's exciting. It gets people engaged in the work. And there are so many depressing issues that we're facing with climate change and many other things that probably are going through the participants' minds, that I think it's helpful if we can be solution oriented, and that even though we have to be realistic, being solution oriented is to say, well, what do we do? What assets do we have? How do we collectively respond to this? And to add on to that, if you can acquire an abundance mindset and see all the wonderful things that exist in your community, even if there are needs, which there clearly are needs, and I'm seeing some of those needs identified in the chat, recognizing the needs and recognizing we want to deal with those, the abundance of natural resources, human relationships, economy, on and on and on, recognizing that, feeling some pride in that, and then planning for that future, I think could engage more people.
If I may toss one little bit of augmentation on, I think optimism, based on what you're saying, I agree, Steve. Optimism is sort of an outcome of resilience. If you're resilient, things are probably going to come out okay, and you can plan for better. You can plan to do, why for us we say, why are we here? We're here to do a little bit of good, to make people's lives better. In a pandemic, we can make people's lives a little better, and that's really satisfying for us. We have an optimistic outlook, but when it comes to being resilient, we try to be realistic.
All right. Well, I think that winds it up pretty nicely. So I want to thank all three of our panelists. You've given us a lot to think about. In our last few minutes together, I just have some things to share as we think about resilience due to what? So how do we get there? How do we start this planning process? And I'm going to let Casey put up that slide. So here we go. So actually, before we put our panel together, Casey and I have been researching resilience probably since April or so, as we knew that we would move into this work. And we found a number of factors that are important for the planning. I've organized these into 4 categories just to present them to you today. I'm going to go through them very quickly, but to say that this is a basis for some of the resiliency planning we will do in the spring together. In the first category, I have called this place-based or business-based. And I think our panelists spoke to some of that. This idea that we look at our assets and it's an asset-based process. We're focused largely on the economy, but I think you can see the interconnectedness of the social networks and the political and the natural systems and all the parts, that the economy doesn't stand on its own. We love in New Hampshire that we are so local and we focus local. Resiliency work really calls us to think beyond local, as Richard said, and to think much broader. So we're going to be encouraging folks to do that, and to be thinking about our built environment. Where is your business located? Does that matter? And how does working from home impact what's happening in communities? How are we blurring the line between public space and private space right now? And how is that benefiting business and community? And where do we work together on that? I think Steve did a really nice job talking about our natural systems and natural resources. Clearly, our biggest asset in economic development is the natural resources that we have here in the state. Just a little bit about quality of life and civic pride. Quality of life is also important in economic development and civic pride. We did some research last year on the importance of Main Street in New Hampshire and actually across the country. And we're really interested to learn that people were valuing their Main Street for civic pride, and they wanted it to look beautiful and bring their friends who came to visit. And the small businesses or the economy rated much lower. I feel like we've been in 7 months of educating our country on the importance of small business on Main Street and what that means for your economy and for jobs and whatnot. So I think there's opportunity there. Certainly we have to look at infrastructure such as broadband, transportation, and whatnot. The other category is what I'm calling people-based, or Sarah was calling it the soft infrastructure. But to think about what are the employee needs? How are employee needs linked to community? What's the impact when school is closed, or that there isn't childcare, or we don't have training? The next is to think about leadership and volunteers. And leadership, I mean that very broadly defined by who steps up to do what. And how can we build on that as we prepare and work towards resiliency? We're called to do broader, deeper community engagement efforts, and to think not just who's not at the table, but whose table do we need to go to in order to bring them into the process. And then, of course, to think about networks, systems, collaboration, partnerships. I think a big message today has been that we can't do it alone, whether you're a business or a community. That's just not going to hold and be successful. And then just two other pieces as we think about our resiliency planning will be the planning part. How are we going to do our assessment? There's lots of tools out there that we can share, and how we go about identifying the threats and what our response will be. Again, broad community engagement, identifying the financial resources that are available to community, to business, to organizations, and thinking about our supply chains and networks. The importance of communication as this resiliency planning is working. And also thinking maybe about a new vision for your community or your business. Where do you want to be that's better and different than where you've been? And finally, the action side of things. So we don't want to just build resiliency plans for the sake of plans. We want to move people to action and make change in their community, be prepared for this next threat that may come along. So we want to look deeper at innovation. We've had lots of good examples today of adaptation. And we're even seeing businesses and communities really transform and become something different because of this current threat of COVID. Interested to look deeper into this idea of redundancy. So if we put a system in place to help us, what are we going to do if that system fails or the next system fails? So being ready for that. And thinking about sustainability, which just means to me that things are ready for the next generation and the generation beyond that. And that this, while we're going to be action oriented, this is long-term work, but we can start small and we've just got to get started. So Casey, let me double check with you. Any final questions from our participants?
Yeah, Molly, there were a couple that snuck in towards the end of the panel discussion. I think this one is for Rich. So how do you see the resiliency planning or efforts you have done serve the current dilemma of instilling consumer confidence in your business to sustain you through the unpredictable duration of the natural disaster, pandemic, other major catastrophe?
Oh, sorry. I'm going to make you ask that again just because my headset unplugged and I didn't hear the question.
It's okay, go ahead. It's a good question.
It is a good question. No problem. So basically, how do you see the resiliency planning or other efforts you have done serve the current dilemma of instilling consumer confidence in your businesses to sustain you through the unpredictable duration of the natural disaster, pandemic, or other catastrophes?
Oh my, we do this all the time anyway. I mean, we get the is there child slave labor in your chocolate? Is there, I mean, we have so many questions that we get. And it's just another one. Consumers have to feel like we are paying attention, we know what we're talking about, and we're giving them real answers. So for us, our first thing we did is on our website, we posted a COVID response. What are we doing both locally in our shop, for our staff, to show that we're aware of what's going on and that we're taking action? That's really important. I mean, for me, customers are great. My staff is more important. That's probably sacrilege, but yeah, I take care of my staff with everything. They take care of my customers. Customers need to know as a business that you're thinking about them. They want to know you're thinking about the staff, that you're thinking about the community. And they give us the wishes. They say, you know, we are so glad you're doing well. We're doing well because we're taking care of people, and it's just communication. So customer confidence, I mean, we have the confidence, we can talk to them, we can tell them what we're doing. We've had no issues with that. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm glad.
Casey, we can take probably one more question.
Okay, here is another one. This is a big question, I think. What does the community's emotional resilience look like?
I feel like Steve is maybe the best one to answer this, but I'll give you like a minute to stall for a second. So here, because I've got a thought that I just wanted to share, which is when I think about emotional resilience, well, it kind of comes to my mind that that's not really in the capitals framework, and it should be. Personal and emotional well-being. I think a lot of things that I've heard during the pandemic is how are we managing self-care during this time? So I think it starts first at an individual level. And I would really welcome this discussion with some public health colleagues who maybe are thinking more about this. And it's maybe a really unique opportunity to do some more collaboration with public health to talk about how do we take care of the individual? And then from there, how does that scale up to at the organizational or business level and then the community level? So those are just some thoughts. And I really appreciate the person who made that comment, because I think it's an area that we need to be thinking more about.
And I'll give a very brief addition to give Steve further a little bit more time, because this is really his. Knowing stuff. The biggest thing that was helpful for us is the state actually communicated pretty clearly early on what we needed to know. And the SBDC was awesome about communicating what we needed to know. And in Manchester, we've been working with the health department, because the less gray space in the world, the more everybody feels warm and fuzzy. And if we can say, yeah, this is what the health department is telling us, this is what the state is telling us, we get rid of that ambiguity that makes people really nervous and emotionally kind of edgy.
I think the two of you had a better handle on this than I do. I was going to say that I think bringing the emotional question in is one of the indications of why I like these conversations so much, because it does bring a whole other dynamic. It does bring in new partners that we should be talking to that can inform us more. I'm kind of all over the map with what I'm picturing, because in some cases we're living more locally right now, but we're even more disconnected because we're afraid to approach neighbors and other people who may be suffering or having a hard time. So the transparency, the communication, bringing in people that maybe know more about that emotional aspect than I personally do, I think this is a great time to do that, to broaden the conversation.
Okay, great. Well, I think that question and your answers challenge us to bring that into Resiliency Academy as we go forward. I want to quickly turn it over to Liz Gray from SBDC so she can share some resilience resources for our participants today. Liz.
Thank you. Yes, so just to make sure that there are some additional resource partners that we are working with, that we encourage any of the businesses or communities to connect with. There's SBDC, we provide the business advising and a lot of other webinars and training opportunities. CWE, you saw Condra introduce herself earlier in the discussion. We definitely encourage you to reach out to them as well. But of course, the communities with Cooperative Extension and CDFA, and then BEA for more of the bigger picture economic development folks. So happy to make any connections that anybody needs. But I also wanted to just thank everybody for joining us today. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I appreciated the perspectives that Rich and Steve and Sarah and Molly shared, and of course the questions from all the webinar participants. You know, Rich's comment, hope for the best, plan for the worst, is spot on. Or plan now, because we really shouldn't be waiting. And honestly, we can't wait. I couldn't agree more with the comments about we need to get resiliency planning integrated into the mindset and culture of businesses and communities everywhere. And was really excited to hear that not only, the participants agreeing along, but the panelists talking about how there is a natural connection between communities and businesses working together towards resiliency. And the conversation around relying on our networks, on our social connections. So that's central to why SBDC wanted to work with Cooperative Extension and CWE and CDFA and others. We all need a support system. No one should feel as though they're in this alone. Everyone should feel connected somehow and know where to go for help. I think we have a lot of work to do, but I can assure you the planning team is up for the challenge and looking forward to helping everyone get prepared for, whatever is next. So I might be one of those optimists, but I think we're up for the challenge. And my call to action to all of you on this call is to be that network connector and encourage people to learn more about the Resiliency Academy and the support that's available, whether you're a community, a nonprofit, or a business owner. And have people join us at the Academy in the spring. We need more people to be coming in. We're really pleased with the response for just the webinars that we're hosting to kick off the Academy work, but we have so much more to do, and we're excited to be able to share that. So please do reach out and connect. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Liz. I also want to thank everyone here today. You will receive information about the spring sessions of Resiliency Academy, but please reach out to us in the meantime if you'd like to. And then finally, we just have a final poll. If you would just share with us one final answer to a question, and then you're welcome to log off. And thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate